welcome everyone. Welcome everyone. Jonathan, I do appreciate you walking and help us out there. Well, before we begin, I'm Theodore Ramsaw, and Ramsaw is fine. That's a good way to call me. And as we begin, can we just go in a circle and everyone say hello and like a 2-second background, something like, I'm Theodore, I'm in K-12 Outreach, and I'm happy that you all come to join us. And can we start here?
Tanisha Lane, PhD candidate in the Higher Adult Lifelong Education Program.
Dave Chafer, I'm in K-12 Outreach, and I'm happy to be here. How's that?
Perfect.
Chris Ryan from K-12 Outreach at the Ed Policy Center, and I'm delighted.
Hi, I'm Tate Abbott Jr., undergrad student, sociology and journalism major, also a part of Black Student Alliance.
I'm Francis Penny, I'm academic advising with Mental Sustainability.
Charlie, last name Wilson. Associate Professor and Academic Coordinator at Olivet College.
I'm Rhonda Miller. I'm from Olivet College, where I'm Associate Dean for Academic Affairs.
I'm Denise Smith. I'm a consultant for multicultural issues with MSU's Office for Inclusion.
Excuse me, Donald Barringer, first year doctoral student in the teacher education department.
Greg White, PhD student in the Education Policy Program.
Jonathan Dahl from Michigan Department of Ed. Happy to be here.
Marcus Annual from the Negro Career Project at Michigan State University.
Can we start here?
Tiffany Caesar, first year PhD student, African American African Studies.
And PK Dozie, Director, African American Studies, and I'm a professor of international relations and international.
I'm Chris Dunbar, and I'm professor in the College of Education and Educational Administration.
Brian Beverly, Olivet College alumni, second year education policy PhD student, and also working in Office of K-12 Outreach.
Jennifer Kudina, I'm assistant professor in the School of Criminal Justice.
Thank you. My brother, you walked in at the right time. Just tell us your name and what college you're from or where you're at.
Absolutely. Good afternoon, everyone. My name is Michael Daniels. I'm a first-year master's student in the Student Affairs Administration program.
Thank you, Jonas. And timing is good. It's a relaxed format, so don't feel anything at all. We appreciate you joining us now. Well, we're going to get right into it there. I normally don't like to talk about myself. I usually do that as you go through the presentation, but in this particular case, I'll give you just a little bit of a framework. I'm born in Chicago. I lived most of my life in Las Vegas. So while I was at the University of Nevada, Las Vegas, when I was working on my PhD is in curriculum instruction, and I taught diversity class. You know, the class y'all have to take diversity. I taught that my 4 years. And while I was there, I also was in Afro-American studies there. In Afro-American studies, come on in and make yourself at home. Hey, good to see you. Come on in. Come on in. Make yourself at home. Chair, wherever you feel comfortable. So while I was at UNLV and teaching in curriculum instruction, I was in Afro-American studies. And in Afro-American studies, I put together a class called Hip Hop Music and Culture. And everybody's heard about a hip hop class. But my class, what I did in that is I used hip hop to teach theoretical frameworks. So it was basically a theoretical framework class. So there's 4 elements of hip hop. There's what they call b-boying, there's graffiti, DJing, and what they call rap, which is people just associate hip hop with just rap. But for example, when I dealt with graffiti, I dealt with political address, and I dealt with concepts such as text image and visual images have just as much things to say as non-text images, right? So tying those things together. So looking at how verbal communication is just as important as text communication. When I dealt with the b-boying, which is dance, I did with a lot of nonverbal communication. Right? And we also did a lot of gender issues, women in videos. Musicology DJing musicology that has to do with different places around the world use music differently. In some places, music, for example, drums may keep time. In a different place, drums actually have a language to it, right? So we taught that. And then we talked about diffusion, social accommodation theory, because being a DJ, you have to work on the audience. And then the very last one, we talked about rap, and we did that from a rhetorical perspective. So while I was teaching that class, I noticed when we talk about gender issues, the males in class basically just sat and didn't say anything. And I was thinking, what was going on here? Well, I realized quickly that the men in class, majority African American men, but I did have a few white males in class too, because everybody likes hip hop, that some of the guys may not have wanted to say anything because they were maybe interested in the girl next to them. Right? They didn't want to say anything and go out of the way. There's a few different things. But it was a quiet space. I said, well, men need a place to have an area, place for communication. Well, just before getting into my master's program, I was a freelance writer for women's magazines. And I learned very quickly that what got published in magazines as a male and what didn't had a lot to do with my name on it. And so I noticed there's a little bit of different perspective. Some people like having a male's perspective on women's issues, and some people don't like having a man's perspective on women's issues. So it's an interesting place. I said, well, let's have a spot to discuss it. So I came up with what I believe the first African American masculinity class. And I did that class to have a safe place for black males to come in and talk about real issues of gender. And I'm so excited to get the class started. I'm all happy, ready to go. And what happens? More females than males. And so it wound up being a really interesting place. But part of the syllabus and the learning principles behind the masculinity class talked about sociological, historical, health, sexual, but dealing with historical, we had basically an entire month on the school to prison pipeline. Now from that class, we wound up having a mentorship program. So that was half college of education, half Afro-American studies. So we kind of combined those two to make the mentorship program. But all that being said, the background behind the historical implications of masculinity and the historical implications of African-American male, it was basically a zero tolerance policy or school to prison pipeline month-long presentation. And a lot of that information is what I have today. So that's what I was going to talk to you about today. But as I started doing research on a few different things, put some stuff together that I thought was interesting, and I sat back, and the patterns that I saw weren't the patterns that I thought were going to be there. I intentionally looked for patterns, but I found all types of patterns that I didn't realize were going to come up. I found a lot of information about Michigan. And some of you may be Michiganders. I think that's what, I don't know where the palm you are. First time I saw somebody, where do I get to? They looked at their palm, and I'm like, okay, this person, I'm trying to get here, and he's looking, and he was like, bro, I was like, okay, anyway, so the Michiganders here. Michigan has some unprecedented things that they've done in regards to education, and has implications for African American males. So those are some of the patterns that I came across, and instead of me talking about all the patterns that I saw, I'm really interested in the pattern that you see as we go along. So we're dealing with the Project 6050. Most of you probably heard of that, right? The 65th anniversary of some important things that have happened, especially in regards to African Americans, but has potential for influence for African American males as well. So we'll get to that in just a moment. But we're going to talk about the historical circumstances that led to the Brown versus Board of Education and the Civil Rights Act. That's embedded. So without further ado, as they say, let's get right to it. So the purpose today, I'm using historiographical perspective and historiography. We're looking at the construction of history and the implications. And to juxtapose, we're juxtaposing history, education history, kind of like a education anthropology, right? So we're talking about theoretical foundations of education, but we're also going to be talking about some of the theorists in Afro-American studies. Because remember, as I said, I had combined those two things for the mentorship program. So for some of us who are in Afro-American studies, there may be some things from education that have come along. Hey, I didn't know this may apply for our undergrad, our master's, and doc work. And then for some of us who are educators, there may be some theorists or theories behind Afro-American studies that we may not have been aware of that may have had some help. And for those of us who are just interested in making the world a better place and have some implications and doing some other things, some outreach, I think looking at that perspective might be helpful. So a couple of things. We're going to amplify our capacity to juxtapose historical American education policies, as well as their resulting outcomes for African American males using frameworks from both education and Afro-American studies. Second, increase knowledge surrounding the field of education with regard to the educational outcomes of African American males in Michigan. So we're going to talk broadly and try and focus, and we're going to see, we did some stuff here, but then this stuff happened here, the African American males over here. It's an interesting pattern. Very lastly, we're going to develop the ability to articulate in detail, in research-based detail, the far-reaching and subtle effects of zero-tolerance policies that lead toward the school-to-prison pipeline. And one of the things that I like to throw in there for some of my policy fellows, people interested in policy, as we go along, let's keep in mind, is it good policy, bad politics? Bad policy, bad politics? Or something in between? There's a couple of other things we can throw in there, but as we go along, you're going to say, well, wait a minute. That sounded like a good idea. What happened? And so why is this important? Because one person can make a difference. So everyone in here, a lot of scholars, a lot of administrators, we have a lot of counselors. I think what's really important, what I feel that will help close the achievement gap, especially in higher ed, not just K through 12, but in higher ed, is having counselors and administrators. I think that's a really good key. When I was in high school, not meaning to push anyone out or call anyone out, when I was in high school, my high school counselor told me that I didn't need to take college prep courses because I wanted to go into the Navy. Anyway, so we're going to connect to some patterns. How has education policies in the U.S., has it helped or hindered African American males? That's an important question. The policies that we're talking about, has it helped or has it hindered? And then how can the theory of multiple intelligences work to help national and state policies that impact education outcomes? We've all heard the term multiple intelligences. Auditory, visual, kinesthetic. When I was working on my second year, an extended version of multiple intelligences, and you guys are all going to laugh, all of you who are in this room. An extended definition of multiple intelligences has to do with K through 12 education, administrators, and college. And I don't think anyone ever thinks about multiple intelligences in that way. We would think that the college, administrators, and the school district all work together. Not as efficiently as how we would think. Okay, so really briefly, this is a legend. 60-50, right? You see that highlighted, okay? Zero tolerance policy, you see that highlighted in blue. Theorists, African American theorists, you'll see that in green. Michigan, you'll see that in orange. Okay? That's kind of my little legend to make sure that you can look at whatever you're interested in first. I'm going to address a few things as we go along. Well, first off, in 1635, the first American public school was established in Boston. I think that's pretty cool that we've been having education for a long time. But right around that time, not too far later, South Carolina outlaws education for Africans, right? Or Africans employed or enslaved Africans. So if we think about the school-to-prison pipeline, we can argue and say the school-to-prison pipeline or zero-tolerance policy is a better acronym. We can argue and say that the zero-tolerance policies actually started when they forbid African Americans to educate themselves. Come back to that in just a second. Here's an interesting thing. 1787, the Northwest Ordinance divided Michigan territory into townships. I don't know if you've ever heard of this. Some of you may have had Michigan history before. Taxes from these townships funded schools. That means Michigan has been funding their schools starting around 1787. And from this is where we get some of the land grant information, where we have where we are today. Okay. Now, MSU didn't start back then, but the taxes and the revenue and the interest and impetus from that is how we got to this building today, which I think is pretty interesting. 1828, the first public school is established in Michigan. Now, in 1831, North Carolina and Virginia outlawed the teaching of enslaved Africans. Okay, so different places around the world. Now, this is what I think is really interesting. There's a lot of pushback against white female teachers being in the classroom with predominantly African American males, but let's look at this. In 1831, North Carolina passed a law forbidding a white man or a woman to teach a slave to read or write by fine or imprisonment. White person teaches a black person, not necessarily a slave. White person teaches a black person how to read, imprisonment or fine. Black person, who's a slave, it teaches another slave to read, is whipped. So we could argue and say zero tolerance policies came close to the 20th century, or close to where we are now. I can't argue that it's right around that time. But anyway, what I think is interesting, we have Prudence Candle. She was placed in jail for educating black girls in Canterbury, Connecticut. Put in jail. And I have Frederick Douglass. Probably could have included him as a theorist, but I have his What to a Slave speech in Rochester, New York. And what is important, we've all heard, or probably heard a little bit about What to a Slave is the 4th of July, but that set the tone behind the thinking of what comes up a little bit later. Are African Americans, or blacks at the time, should they be included as Americans? But more importantly, Margaret Douglass jailed for teaching blacks to read in Virginia. So all across the United States we have some things. But interestingly, the Dred Scott versus Stanford U.S. Supreme Court case ruled that people of African descent imported as slaves and their descendants, free or not, were not considered citizens of the United States. So this debate that Frederick Douglass illuminated back then is what was going on around the country. Now, shortly afterwards, we have the Civil War, we have the Emancipation Proclamation, right? And then from here, from 1787 to 1862, Memorial land grants were used to establish land grant colleges. Okay. Interesting way to start. But by 65, we had the 13th Amendment to the Constitution. Neither slavery nor involuntary servitude shall accept as punishment for crime whereof the parties shall have been duly convicted, shall exist within the United States or any place subject to their jurisdiction. Except for punishment for crime. What we know about zero tolerance policies is zero tolerance policies in education are mirroring, prison policies in the United States. Tough on crime has a reflection of tough on school crime, resulting behavior, suspensions. But here's something interesting. We've all heard of Kalamazoo. In 1875, Kalamazoo, Michigan, established public high schools funded by taxes. All right. Well, Kalamazoo later used the same ruling to establish a university and later the first agricultural college in America. MSU is one of the oldest colleges in the United States. Between 1876 and 65, we have the Jim Crow laws. We're familiar with that. Separation between blacks and white, including education. But shortly after that, in 1896, Plessy versus Ferguson ruled that racial separation is legal. This catapulted the phrase separate but equal, based on the 13th Amendment, except as punishment for crime. It's interesting, we have crime twice. And then crime is one of the things that's being associated with African American males. That's a pattern that I didn't see coming. Now I have that 1899, W.B. Du Bois publishes the Philadelphia Negro. And just for clarification, people say Du Bois. Du Bois actually said his name was Du Bois, pronounced like that. Around that same time, there was an African American young woman who had a PhD. Her name was Du Bois. So you'll see writings by another African American with the same last name. I think that's kind of cool because I think for a black woman to have a PhD at 1899 is pretty cool. So anyway, so right after that we have Booker T. Washington, he publishes The Future of the American Negro, okay, another landmark book, okay, and pushes the notion that African Americans newly released from slavery should focus on economic security and education. Now, the Philadelphia Negro was the first urban ethnography in the United States. So Du Bois, back in the day, was looking at some of the same things that are going on today in Philadelphia, big city, large population of African Americans, trying to find out what's going on. Now, Du Bois and Booker T. Washington, we've heard about the great debates between those two. Well, research actually indicates that Du Bois and Booker T. Washington were actually friends, and that a lot of those debates were staged. And they staged those debates so that people could have conversation. So, didn't have TV, didn't have football games, but to get people engaged in conversations, one of the things they would do, let's have a debate. Well, folks didn't have nothing else to do, let's go to a debate, let's see what's going on. So a lot of those things were staged. Towards the end, there were some disagreements, but there's documentation of Du Bois and Booker T. having a debate. After the debate that same night, Booker T. would give some money to Du Bois to do something. Stuff that's interesting. But W.E.B. Du Bois publishes the term double consciousness. And the reason why I put this here is for educators who may not have been familiar with that. We don't get taught African American theorists in the College of Education, not here, but in general. But the double consciousness is looking at the world from a double moral perspective, normally an African American perspective, where you have American, you have African American, and you're always looking at the world from two sides. That's an important theoretical framework when you're thinking about working with, connecting to, and working for African American males. Next up, we have Carter G. Woodson. In 1933, he's also the guy that came up with the idea that became Black History Month. But he has the Miseducation of the Negro. You may have heard of that before. So he was looking at how Eurocentric frames of thinking and valuing knowledge are different than what's taught in school. So in 1933, he was looking at the way classrooms are structured to make it almost an oppositional culture in a room for white female teachers and students of color from 1933. But here we get to the 1954 Brown versus Board of Education. First one for 60/50. U.S. Supreme Court ruled that separate but unequal education of black and white children was unconstitutional. However, while not officially legal, education in the U.S. is still unofficially separate and unequal. So, to be very honest, is this good policy, bad politics? Or is it a bad policy, good politics? And what do I mean by that? To be very honest, I have no idea why we celebrate the Brown versus Board of Education. I have no idea why. Because what happened after Brown versus Board of Education, we had to have a second court case. Why? Because we talk about the language, all deliberate speed. The U.S. District Court ruled that Prince Edward County, Virginia, did not have to desegregate immediately. White students in the county were given assistance to attend white-only private academies. They were taught by teachers formerly employed by the public school system, while black students had no education at all unless they moved out of the county. So Brown versus Board of Education, all separate, right? Separate but equal. Well, there's been an argument, and what I thought this argument meant was that when we had segregated classes, African Americans did not have the same materials and inferior equipment, but they had teachers that cared about them, whereas the white, quote-unquote, children had the good materials and everything was okay. And so because African Americans didn't have the same materials, that was some of the discrepancies. Right? And so the thinking was behind it that if you had teachers that cared about you, things would go a little bit better. And this is really significant for me because when I went to a family reunion on my dad's side of the family about 12 years ago, I met a guy that wound up being my dad's cousin, first cousin. My dad is what you call light-skinned African-American. He's a lighter-skinned African-American male, very light eyes, curly hair, but my dad is real big, okay? When I played football, people used to tell me, how come you're not built more like your dad? Is what he's getting. So this is my dad. I see another guy, he walks in the room, I'm like, this dude looks like my dad. Winds up being my dad's first cousin. Same age. My dad was telling me a story when they played football in high school. The announcer would get on, it's the Ransaw versus the Ransaw showdown, right? Because they played on went to two different schools, right? So they're playing that up. My dad's cousin went to a segregated school. So instead of thinking about this being a long time ago segregated school, this is very recent for me. That guy could have been my father for all practical purposes. From the same city, same town, same age, same family, almost a lot of the same basic DNA. How would my education and my worldview have been framed if my father had gone from a segregated school? So this is what I was thinking, that the information about the Brown versus Board of Education and why some people think that having African-American only schools for African-American teachers, African-American students is better. What I found out after doing research about this, and that's not the case, what the case really was, why one was so important, is that it gave the option for, okay, this county is fine. We can have segregated schools, cool. But the white parents can just take their kids and move somewhere else. And leave this here, start another one here. And that's why they had Brown versus Board of Education too. That had never dawned on me, that is what happened. And so if we look at what's happening, I remember when I was younger, you made fun of other folks. You would say, oh, they so country, right? Because the country folks didn't talk right, didn't speak right, didn't know what was going on, but folks in the city were the ones that were smart. But now, because of the way society has moved, right, a lot of the rich folks, right, we had the suburbanites, all right, they left. So if we look at where all the good, it used to be the best schools were in the city. Now, when a lot of the white population has left, now all the good cities are in the suburbs. This Brown versus Board of Education and why it's important, I see, but I think it's important in different ways. But that's one of my patterns. You may have some other patterns that you see. This is important. Little Rock 9, you've all heard of Little Rock 9. 9 students had to have armed intervention to allow them to go to a school. There are 3 people in this room. And the reason why this is important, there's 3 people in this room who are associated with a gentleman named Robert Green. Now, Robert Green was a dean here at Michigan State University. He was head of Dr. King's education task force between 65 and 66. But the reason why that's important is Dr. Green was the first black dean at MSU. But he also had one of the students from Little Rock 9 as a freshman. MSU especially has a really interesting, significant relationship with civil rights movement and education. Just want to toss it in there because I know there's a couple of folks in the room who know Dr. Green very closely. Then we had the Civil Rights Act of '64, extended the Civil Rights Act of 1875 to include outlawing public discrimination in public facilities, including schools. All right, so we went from blacks weren't considered citizens to now they are considered citizens, but now they aren't really considered citizens, but they are considered citizens, but then we have Jim Crow laws, but then segregation is okay, but then segregation is not okay, but then segregation is not supposed to happen, but it's okay in this particular county, to now you're going to outlaw discrimination in public schools. We've had national policy, state policy. Some were good ideas, some weren't. 1970, Clifton Wharton is elected the president of Michigan State University. Michigan State University had, a Big Ten college, had a black university president in 1970. And so an interesting pattern that I can see, how do we get from having a black president of the university in 1970 to having low graduation rate for African American males in 2013, 2014? I don't even understand. I don't, not blaming anyone. But if you just sit back and you look at what happened from 1970, before a black president. And then we have the Brown versus Board of Education 3, reopened. And the open enrollment for schools that had the potential to continue to divide between black and white children was upheld. A couple of things here. Dr. Cross publishes his Negro sense model. That's the African American identity model, for those who may not have heard it, combined with pre-encounter, encounter, immersion, and internalization. Some of us in African American studies may have heard of that, some of us in education may not. I want to throw that in there, so I'm addressing both needs. We also have a guy named Foucault, and he has a book called Discipline and Punish. And what's interesting for those who may not have been familiar with Foucault from Afro American Studies is he talks about that punishment becomes a model for control of an entire society, including which are schools modeled on the prison system. So what? Well, a couple of things. Dr. Eric Bell publishes Serving Two Masters, and he comes up with what we deal with, critical race theory. And that plays a big role for college education in Afro-American studies and for some of the outreach and civil rights and social justice work. Critical race theory looks at race critically, but it comes from a legal perspective, starting and summarizing from the Brown versus Board of Education of how legal policy affects race, or its policies racialized. Don't worry, we're almost towards the end, and I'm going to open up the floor for discussion and some questions. Zero tolerance policy. There has been some conversation about the zero tolerance policy, starting with gun control laws. The first instances of zero tolerance policy was when Nancy Reagan said, just say no, right, to drugs. Okay, now why is that important? Well, that started President Reagan doing the war on drugs. And so from there, we get students who bring drugs onto a campus being expelled. There's one glaring example of a young lady in junior high school having menstrual cramps. She has aspirin in her pocket. She goes to school. She's expelled from school. Zero tolerance policy. A few years before, we had the Gun-Free School Act. About 12 years before. Another guy that's important is a guy named John Ogbu. You may have heard of that. Ogbu has this theory. He talks about that African American males in the classroom do not exceed well because they're afraid of acting white, because acting white is a stereotype where if you're acting smart, you're acting right, white, you don't get any cultural capital, you don't need any girls want to go out with you, you can't raise your hand in class like I talked about earlier that happened in my classroom. But Ogbu didn't say that they were just having fear of acting white. By the way, John Ogbu's research dealt with middle to upper class African Americans and not lower class African Americans. I don't think that's talked about enough. But also, he says that it's not just they're afraid of acting white. He's saying there's both societal and school discrimination, instrumental community factors such as perceptions of lack of jobs and black oppositional culture are three interrelated factors in which to examine black students' low academic behavior. People focus on the acting white, they miss the other parts too. Now, some would say that if we're having a serious discussion about African American males in the classroom, we would get interrupted. Another guy, Molifi Asante, publishes Afrocentricity, which talks about centering everything you do from the heart of Africa perspective. I want to throw those two theories in for some of us who are in education, who may not have come across those theories. Drug-Free School and Campuses Act banned the unlawful use, possession, or distribution of drugs and alcohol by students and employees on school grounds and college campuses. which means that if a student has a headache, you can't give them aspirin. If you do, some stuff happens. Gun-Free School Act, we talked about. Act required every state to pass a law requiring, and this is important, educational agencies to expel from school for no less than 1 year any student found in possession of a gun. I have that under zero tolerance policies. Why? Some people are like, well, zero tolerance policy. All right. Minor infractions, extended outcomes, do something wrong, minor infraction, you're expelled for a year. Some schools have to have zero tolerance policies because if they don't, they lose funding. So if we think about alternatives to zero tolerance policies that lead to, quote unquote, the school to prison pipeline, well, if you eliminate first of all, having tough on crime makes your school look good and parents kind of go to your school. And if you don't have tough on crime policies, parents will draw students from your school. But in addition to that, you can lose funding if you don't have those. But two things, 2003, Rudder versus Bollinger. The Supreme Court upheld the affirmative action policy at the University of Michigan Law School. I think that's interesting. But more interesting is 2005, the Kalamazoo Promise, which I think is amazing, where students from that district, you get a 4-year scholarship for a bachelor's or 130, if you need 130 credits to pay for tuition and mandatory fees. Michigan has done some amazing things in terms of education. Last page, y'all. Then we'll get into some discussion. 2005, Florida is the first state to improve the Stand Your Ground law. Stand Your Ground law gives individuals the right to use deadly force to defend themselves without having to retreat from a person who poses an immediate threat or feels that they are in immediate danger. Well, why is that important? Well, if we just jump down a little bit later, Trayvon Martin, he was shot to death. Why was he shot to death? Well, he was shot to death while he was suspended from school. Anyways, race to the top, we've talked about that, but in 2012, Michigan Governor Rick Snyder and Michigan Department of Education Superintendent Michael Flanagan announced a resolution to address school discipline issues impacting student outcomes. Again, Michigan is on the forefront of trying to make change. They have something called the African American Young Men Promise Initiative, which is by the Michigan Department of Education. That's an initiative where schools can sign up to do a set of interventions, climate and culture, vocabulary, positive phone calls home. It's the only school of the state and the only state in the union that's doing something like this. At the same time, in 2014, right now, black students are petitioning the University of Michigan for social justice and equity. At the same time. And very lastly, right after that, not related, the Michigan Department of Education drafts a policy on alternatives to suspensions and expulsions. One thing I want to cover, the Education Secretary, Arnie Duncan, and General Holder, they announced and launched a collaborative project, the Supportive School Discipline Initiative. Right now, the United States is looking at unfair disciplinary laws in schools right now as we speak. So one thing that's clear to my mind is you could have good policy, but locally it can be subverted. But then again, you could have a bad policy, but locally the people can get that policy overturned or changed. And so now, more than anything else, I have more questions than answers. want to open up the floor for discussions. I know I saw a few faces here. Some people are thinking about it. Now, when you sit back and you look at just what happened, not intent, not pointing a finger or blaming anyone, if you just lay it down and you sit back and look at the patterns that sift up, what patterns do you see? I told you about 2 patterns that I saw. What patterns do you see? We have a little bit of time to talk about.
So given the history that you presented,
Yes, sir.
what impact do you think the policies have on African American males, both in K-12 and higher education?
I think it is very clear that there are the policies that were created that made the classroom difficult for African Americans to succeed. I think that's very clear. But also at the same time, it seems like to me, this people have actually came up with ideas, realized that that's an unfair policy and tried to change it. But it seems like to me, as soon as they realized it and tried to change it, they changed it again. So the implications are, I think, 2 things. Number one, Michigan has done some amazing things. I think the African American Young Men in Promise initiative is amazing. I also think that what Flanagan is trying to do is amazing. But I'm thinking that African American Young Men in Promise trying to have alternatives to school suspension is something they're doing, is an amazing policy. But that's an example of good policy. What I'm worried about is the bad politics. So we have the potential, because people actually realize that there's a problem and trying to do something about it. So I don't necessarily think that the awareness is a problem. I don't think the policy is a problem. I think the implications of the policy. Because let's be frank, if we look at the achievement gap between African American males and other students, in this particular case, we said white students, white parents aren't going to be like, oh, there's an achievement gap for African American males. Let me go ahead and slow my kids down so that the black males catch up. That's not what's going on. Okay? I'm not pointing fingers, but that's not what's going on. And I know for a fact there have been a few principals who said we're going to help close the achievement gap for African American males in our school. White parents were upset. Principal gets fired. Now, wanting to have the best for your kids, I don't think it's racist. I don't find that racist. I think that's part of the thing. You want the best for your kids. All right? And so, getting back to your question, those are what I see as the policy implications. I think that if these 2 policy initiatives, one, the national, right, and then the state draft that they're doing for alternatives to zero tolerance policies, I think if those are 2 really good policies, I'm worried about the politics. Because there's a thinking that if you do something for this particular group, they're taken away. I did a presentation at Manchester University a couple of weeks ago to Dr. King Committee, Founders Day. I spoke on the same microphone and same stand that Dr. King had used when he did a speech back then. And I made the statement that I have a dream speech. The first half of the speech talks about, Dr. King was talking about having economic equality, not just racial equality. Right? And we talked about some of the same banks that ripped everyone off within the last 10 years were some of the same banks that profited from slavery, insurance, slavery, and then we have these big CEOs, executives doing a few different things. Then they rip off everyone in the United States. They get a write-off, right? And for the first time, I think whites and blacks are starting to understand that it wasn't all white people that were slave owners. There's a few small group of people who were slave owners that put the thumb on everybody, kind of like the banking system. And so we need to have some equity for that. One of the first questions I got from an adult in the room said, well, what are we going to do about those who just don't work hard enough? I'm like, did you miss the whole part about they ripped the whole United States off? They ripped everybody off. Got caught, and what happened? Nothing. Example of bad policy, but awareness of the problem, and people feeling that if you help one particular group, it takes away from the other. Jonathan, you have your hand up, sir.
I have 2 questions.
2 questions.
One is that I feel like, first of all, that white folks aren't that smart. There's a number of white folks that have privilege, and they might do very well, but there's also a number of folks that don't have that, and or just don't do well. But somehow chasing the gap, chasing an average, doesn't seem to me as if we're setting our eyes on the prize. Instead, we're just setting our eyes on the lowest hurdle that we want to get higher than. And so I wonder if we could bring our discussion towards a higher bar than that.
Okay.
But secondly, I wonder if there should be a state agency unit, not sure what type of entity, but that's primary focus is success for African American students in this state, specifically males. But as I ask that, I just think of a model of advocacy, and we have advocacy for so many other student groups, and I think it's time. That's my opinion as a private person. I'm not speaking for the Department of Ed, though that's my role. But I'm just saying, I think, I'm serious.
He wants to make sure he has a job.
It's just me.
Right.
Anyway, what are some thoughts?
Raising the bar. I think any help we can have for African American males in general. I am about equity across the board, but I think that group has a little bit of needs a little bit of extra push. Any other thoughts for the applicants?
Yeah, a couple of things.
Yes, sir.
I really like how you linked zero tolerance policy to history with respect to the fact that it's always, or it had been, it started out being zero tolerance policy.
Even for white people.
That may well be true. What do you mean by that?
Well, the white person helped the black person, that black person got automatically in prison. Okay. So even, that's a zero tolerance policy to me. It set up the chain. But anyway, I didn't mean to interrupt. Please continue, sir. Pardon me.
So when I think about zero tolerance policy, and I think about the 20,000 or more who've been suspended or expelled right in DPS, or the 6,000 that have been suspended in EAA schools, suspended or expelled. And I don't know how many of those are repeat offenders, but the number is egregious, without question. So when I think about particularly Detroit, where they're predominantly African American, and we had that many kids being suspended or expelled. And in many of these schools, there are African Americans in leadership. So I'm wondering, just out loud, what is that saying about the leadership and about the number of African American kids that are being thrown out, and we have black leadership in place? That's one thought. The other is...
oh, he's got more? That's enough. Okay.
Well, you were talking about Du Bois for a minute.
Yes, sir.
And how some of the debates were staged. But both of those cats had folks behind them. I mean, the guy, I'm blanking on his name, with Hampton Institute, where he thought that Booker T was the greatest thing since toast or sliced cheese, or whatever that expression is. But and so when their philosophies, Du Bois and his philosophy about the intellectual African American leading the race of people, and Booker T, well, we need to just work and labor until we're accepted. I think when I think about those two arguments, those are big arguments. But you said that, you know, some of this was staged, and I know there were money behind each of these folks who had agendas that they wanted to push forward. But later in Du Bois' work, he had to change a venue, or no, a perspective rather. And that perspective being that if black children in these schools are being discriminated against, then maybe it's a better idea that we have black teachers and to lead these schools. So there were people that were pretty upset with him because he had sort of changed that position. But Carter G. Woodson, on the other hand, argue that teachers in those environments, particularly white teachers, were teaching these students that they were inferior. And if you're gonna go to a school that's teaching you that you're inferior, then that does more harm than you're sitting in that classroom learning what it is you're supposed to be learning. Now, I said a few things only because you said so many. So, if you could give me some thoughts on this Detroit piece.
I'll give you a couple thoughts, and then I'll open up, because I know some other people might want to respond to both of those. I'm sorry, did you want to go first?
No.
Okay, first one, I think that from all the amazing things that Michigan has done in terms of education, I found it is absolutely amazing that we have so much segregation in Detroit. And it's so amazing that that is a reflection of I believe, the graduation rate or lack of graduation rate. I think that's because we go from having a black university, one of the first black university president, to having low graduation rates at the university 10, 20, 30 years later. It's just, I think it's amazing. But I think if we look at what's been happening in Detroit and expansions and expulsion, I'm thinking that from what the pattern talks about, we talk about Foucault, is that we are mirroring the prison system with the education system. Right? So the prison system or the prison incarceration system is a multi-billion-dollar corporation. And those whole entire communities that come up around when prisons are built. Right? And so there's so much money going on behind that. Is I think that's been the framework of our thinking, because we live in a world where it's okay for all students to want to wear a black man's Nikes if he plays ball, but no one actually wants to walk in his shoes. And so what I'm saying by that is that what we think of criminal is black. And if society is replicating what is criminal by being black and male, and then if you have a black male in the classroom, then what is going to be represented, right? We know that black males are put in suspension, expelled, all of those things, more so than any other ethnic group. And I think that's a reflection of both.
So we have taken on that same image.
Well, I think
African Americans see black and see criminal.
I think sometimes, but what I think is more important is when I see disconnect between African American teachers and African students in the classroom, I see more class than cultural. One of the first things for me as a professor that I had to realize when I'm around my African American students, my first couple of years, it took me a long time to deal with this, and even my white students, is that I come from a privileged background. From even my white students, my grandmother, both of my grandmothers went to college. One of my grandmothers has a master's degree. 80% of the women in my family have degrees, and most of them are teachers. So, but I'm a third-generation college graduate. I don't think I've ever been in a college room with my students that there's been more than one or two students who's had a grandparent that went to college. So I am teaching from, I'm thinking we're all black, we're all the same. I got African-American students in my classroom. I'm saying stuff, they're looking at me like I'm crazy. It took me a long time to go through and debrief that. So I see more class problems in that between African teachers who are dealing with their African students. But I also see, in addition to that, they may be subject to zero tolerance policies where they may have no choice. Because if you're not given a choice, you may see a discrepancy, but there's nothing you can do about it. So that's what I see about this problem. I saw a couple other hands. I see it. I've got yours 1, 2, and 3. Okay, so.
Just a quick
yes, sir.
observation, since this is a 60-50 celebration, and you did actually just mention the incarceration issue. And I was really pleased to see the announcement by Eric Holder this morning that the president and the government will do everything it can to reverse state policies that disenfranchised, formerly incarcerated people skewed by sort of African Americans and minorities. But you know, I thought that was a great sort of announcement. And even though the federal government can't do much because these are state policies, Obama through Eric Holder has pledged to do what he can to sort of influence the state to have the states reverse that policy. I wanted to know, perhaps you could talk a little bit more about why it is that you, I know the reason, but I want you to talk about it. Why is it that you sort of distinguish African American males in this question of educational inequality? How do you see the sort of gap between African American males and African American women? How do you explain it? And why do you, focus on policies that will, sort of support achievement among males and not black women?
Thank you. Well, first off, my position is the Achievement Gap Specialist for Males of Color. So I wanted to make sure that I have exactly what I do in my job title in this presentation. Number one, so my boss will let me do the presentation. So my boss will let me do the presentation.
Okay.
That's number one. Right. But number two, well, no, she's not.
Okay.
No, well, because I want to make sure that I'm doing my job description.
I see.
All right. But secondly, I think when we look at the achievement gap, there's achievement gap for, I think, students of color, but I think the achievement gap is most pronounced between African American males, number one. But secondly, African American women are one of the largest academic achieving and financially achieving minority groups in the United States. So that being said, I think it's somewhere roughly between 95 and 2005, African American women increased their master's degree attainment by 180% around that time, roughly around that period. But around that same period of time, just 1 or 2 years before and just 1 or 2 years after, African American and Latino women increased their incarceration by 850%. Women, Latinas. And so what's going on right now is that there is going to be a new gap that's coming along, and I see it coming between African American and Latino women, but definitely I see another gap coming, right? But from what I've seen, although I'm aware of that, I haven't seen enough information and enough data, enough conversation about that to start having an organized conversation about it. So I don't want to say that I overlook the problem. I see that problem coming along, and I've been having.
Can't you see the problem as a problem of black children? Why distinguish by gender, apart from the process of marriage?
Well, more than anything else, I just see that there being a larger gap for African American males than for the African American girls in the class, number one. But at the same rate, I do recognize that that is the next part of the conversation that's right around the corner, that's knocking on the door and about to come in. And I haven't seen enough. I haven't had it. Let me rephrase that. I'm going to be frank. I've been disappointed about the research, the lack of research in that area. And I would like to do more research in that area. All right? And so to give you an example, when I did research on that, what's going on with the achievement gap for African American girls, women.
Again, not to interrupt you, my own position is not to segregate the two at all, to do a policy intervention on black children. What is your take on that?
I see that's important and necessary. I see that's important and necessary. I think that's what we should do. All the research that I've come across when I was trying to address that problem for both girls and boys, I did research on whether there should be single gender classrooms or not. And I also did, and this is not specific what you said about what we can do to solve the problem, specifically African American girls, if there's some things the same, some things not. And I haven't seen enough research, and I've been disappointed about the research in that area for me to talk about. So I feel strongly about it. But I haven't seen enough research to grab it and present it in a way and sort of will be. And so to go what I was going to say earlier, when I did research on the achievement gap African American girls, I know that's not what you were saying, most of the research I said, and I quote, that the problem with African American girls is that they're getting pregnant. And so if we want to increase graduation rates for African American girls, don't get pregnant. That was 3 articles. And I was there's got to be more to it than that. I haven't seen enough serious discussion about being treated as problem within the African American family other than negative things. I haven't seen enough conversation about that to have an intelligent conversation. I just have emotional reaction to it. So I kind of like kept the research, and I've got a few things, but I don't have anything where, here's a couple of ideas, here's a couple of suggestions. Most of it is just horrible, we need to do something. So that's where I'm at with that. But I think that's important. Two.
All right. I was responding to some of Dr. Dunbar's questions he put on the table about the situation in Detroit as he brings out.
I've got another meeting, but since you said
as a Detroit native who went through Detroit public schools
Me too.
and raised my
Proud
kids,
product.
there we go, in Detroit public schools, been there. I remember way back to Coleman Young when he was in office. I think there are a couple things that happened at the same time and overtime in the city of Detroit. I think one, you have racism, disinvestment, and a lack of accountability for an extended time frame. I think with disinvestment, you didn't have the resources to continue providing quality education. A lot of people don't remember when Detroit did have one of the best school systems in the entire nation. But when you started to have the flight of educated people and capital, you started to lose that kind of situation with federal policies that encourage the flight of people who had education and capital. I used to work for the U.S. Department of Housing and Urban Development, and so I know of this stuff firsthand. When they started building expressways, they only went one direction. They went outside of Detroit. When they started with the policies for people to go outside, they offered low-interest mortgages to people outside Detroit and none to people who wanted to stay in Detroit. When you start to have large-scale federal disinvestment on that level, then not only does white flight negatively affect your school system, but the flight of educated black middle-class people is probably one of the things I see as the most damaging situation for education in the city of Detroit. Because you had a largely uneducated force left, and here it is 2014, 47% of Detroiters are still illiterate. Then you have racism and lack of accountability. I think that black people migrated into positions of leadership, but I don't know that they had the power that came along with the title. And I look at where we sit presently, and as I was listening to Dr. Renshaw use the amazing things in Detroit, I think it's because we have different realities with you coming from the left coast and me staying here most of my life. For me, I look at the larger socio-political forces at work. On one hand, you got policies that definitely do not work for our children, like an increase in charter schools, but no increase in investment in our public schools. Those kinds of things have their own certain level of inertia. You look at the bankruptcy of Detroit, you also have a bankruptcy in our Detroit public schools, but the thing is, on the side of a city, you have people who will come and cancel that debt. Detroit public schools, you have hundreds of millions of dollars of debt that's not been dealt with, but you created a situation that has supplanted the traditional public school model. I think all of these things are coming together in a very negative way. Then you have the unlimited charter schools and unlimited online schools. These things do not work to positively impact our kids and our community. And I think that there's another part to it is this passive and active creation of realities. I think there's a lot of media out there. When I was teaching, I taught in Detroit, I taught in Boston, I taught in Saline, I taught in Ann Arbor. And every place I had students of color. And one of the things I would give people as an assignment is, look at what's on TV, look at what's coming through your radio for 7 days. And at the end of 7 days, that body of information, analyze it for yourself and see what it says about black people, about black kids, about black men, black women, black boys, black girls, and see if you're comfortable with that. That's a very uncomfortable thing to do, to sit with your own data from a week, because you're passively internalizing this. And I think as a community, honestly, we've stopped proactively telling our story. And because we don't proactively tell our story, we either have to wait for somebody else to tell it for us, or we end up internalizing this negativity that is pushed through mass media outlets. Then the last thing I was thinking about when Jonathan brought up his question, should we have a task force, state level, this, and that, and other? I absolutely agree that we should, and I don't think it should be separated by gender. But the political reality, I don't know if that's feasible, or for a couple reasons. One, I think about the fact that pushing race-based initiatives, as the University of Michigan rep, that hasn't worked well for us in this country, to be quite candid with you. And I think that given the demographic profile of our nation, as we're transitioning into a nation of color, I think it's going to be problematic to continue to promote this white versus black ideology when our country as a whole is collectively moving towards shades of brown.
I was just so close to your sir. Is that good? Response?
I don't know that it answers the question of why we have 20,000 kids that are being suspended or expelled.
I think this is something that I feel
I mean,
like
I think
honestly-
you said, and we've internalized.
Absolutely. I think this
That's
is the way that they handle our people for not understanding our people, fearing our people, and this is traditionally how they've addressed the situation, by pushing us out, putting us in these spaces where we're self-contained. I mean, I remember it myself.
So do we have agency ourselves?
Yes,
I
no.
would agree, and I would, using Detroit as the example, when you think about how do you politically hold people accountable for what's going on in our school systems, when literally most of the black communities in the state of Michigan do not have democratic power anymore by extension of these emergency manager laws.
And before that,
If I'm in Detroit right now and I want to go hold somebody accountable, who do I speak to? I'm a parent of a kid. Who would I even speak to? The EAA, who's in bed with the state level bureaucrats? I don't think so. DPS, who installed an accountant to fix the system? I don't think so. You know, I don't think any of those people or personalities have a history of positively impacting our communities, and I think they're reproducing behaviors that they've seen historically as associated by those things taken on the street.
okay, no, all right, so we
I had
had,
to go too.
okay. We had here and then we'll go there, right? It was, thank you, both of those. You had something?
Oh, yeah, I just wanted to, once again, thinking about this idea of black leadership, that you could be the leader, but you're still confined by state, federal, and institutional policies. So I could be the face of an institution or a unit or a program or whatever the case may be, but if I don't have the power to really enact the policies that it takes to improve conditions, I'm still limited. And so you need a creative kind of leadership to address some of these things. So people have to know how to operate within the context of policy to still address the issues. I.e., why are we focusing on men and not women or both or whatever the case may be? In 2010, I believe it was, ACE did a report on men of color. And so what's happening now in education is that men are struggling across race and ethnicity, even white men. Yes. Even here at Michigan State University, when you look at who's on academic probation, those are largely men. So the achievement of men is shifting, and it is grounded in some of the things you talked about, these males and masculinities. And if you look at the work of Harper and Harris, and they talk about that, you know, men do need spaces across race and ethnicity, need spaces to talk about these things, unpack these things, deal with the change in society, deal with the changing expectations of their roles and what all that means, you know, in the grander scheme of society. So I think there's definitely a need for programs and practices to address both men and women, but I think those approaches can't be the same. When you think about why black men and men in general may be disengaged in the classroom, oftentimes the way that a classroom is operated is from a feminine perspective. Sit down, be quiet, do your assignment. You know, whereas boys may want to be more active, more playful. They learn different kinds of ways.
Yeah,
and I think sometimes that's not
the feminization of education, yes.
And I think some of those things are not taken into consideration. So when you were talking about this idea between policy and politics, like, yeah, there may be good ideas, but how you implement that has to be different, and it has to be consistent with the issue that you're trying to address.
Well, that brings me up, I want to push on this for a second. So I had, and I saw another hand here. I saw we had two more hands. So I'll go very quickly. So the we had a mentorship program. So while I was at a school and I was leaving, I talked to the principal on the way out. There was a little African American lady. She was crying. She had a rough day. And I was like, oh, I'm gonna pull out my bag of tricks and I'm gonna talk to her, because I had all the stuff from my mentorship program. Opened my bag and I looked in and I was gonna read her a story, and all the stuff I had were stories about African American males. I said, oh my God, I don't have anything for little black girls. So I wound up the very next 3 months having a separate mentorship program for girls for that reason, because I saw a few things that needed to be done, but I had difficulties trying to figure out in the mentorship program, and I have all African American males do a mentorship program with African American young girls for obvious reasons, but will they respond? And I didn't get enough information about one way or the other. So I did experience it to try to deal with it, and I'm still waiting for some additional resources. But I do have a whole really good reading list for African American young ladies, just so you know. We have a hand here, then we'll go there, if that's okay.
You touched a little bit about imprisonment, and I'm wondering if you've read Michelle Alexander's New Jim Crow,
Yes.
Mass Incarceration in the New Age of Colorblindness. And so she argues that mass incarceration operates very much like the Jim Crow, in that formerly incarcerated individuals are facing legal forms of discrimination in terms of dealing with barriers to education, dealing with stigma, can't vote. And I'm wondering if you could talk a little, since you read, but since you talk a little bit about that, since you talk about the Jim Crow and its implication on African American males, and again, she makes a strong stance in that we still have a new form of Jim Crow, and it's legalized, and African Americans largely are the ones who are disproportionately incarcerated. So if you can talk about that a little bit more.
Well, in the interest of time, one of the things that I see when we look at Brown versus Board of Education 1 and then 2, and before we get to 3, if we look at between 1 and 2, that you had, instead of you being able to say, okay, I'm going to take my white kids from this and then move here and then do a different county, but when you're stuck, what I see happening is when you can't take your white kids and move somewhere else, then but what you can do is you can accept by discipline or punish, you can put them for expulsion or suspension. And so I see that, so we have Jim Crow laws in German, but I think in the classroom, in K-12 education, I see that being a self-form of, well, it's supposed to be desegregated, but you're segregating the children within the classroom, and that you can do legally by the zero tolerance policy. And so that's what I see the implications for that. Briefly, because I would love to talk about that. There's another hand here. Now, we've gone over time. I'm good. I recognize we have to go. There's another hand here. Yes, young lady.
Just being a young person, I look around the room. I mean, usually something that I find is the underlying problem is being ignorant. And I think that sometimes, like even with this discussion, like usually when these kind of discussions take place on campus, and I'm usually at a lot of them, it's always the people that kind of know what's going on, that understand the problem. I think that the answer more so, and the reason why I really say ignorance is because it's not even just we don't know what's going on, but like even with politics, I'm very interested in politics, but that's not my major, but that's something that I have a good background on. And I see like just being involved in that room, you have a lot of people with good ideas, as you talked about, but when you're ignorant to what these people actually live, life experiences, because when I sat in the room over the summer, we had a lot of people who were, not going to say what party I was with or anything like that, but they were pushing all of these ideas and stuff, but you don't understand the struggle of a black person, especially because usually it's white males, especially dominating in politics. So when I'm sitting in this room and we're going back and forth and you're not understanding the actually lived experience of these people coming from urban communities, it kind of makes me question, these are people that are making policies. So your policies in general are going to be ignorant because you're not looking at the full circle. Being at MSU, I find that being a leader on campus, we're usually engaging in these conversations with the choir. How do you engage with the people that really need it? Because that's the reason that they're not, staying long. And I think that one thing that I did do, this probably a year ago, I went to a black faculty and staff meeting. And I think for African American students particularly, it's the disconnect of not knowing that they exist. And I think that one way to start, just being at MSU, because you did speak on us having a black president in 1970, and us now being one of the lowest, having the lowest retention here at MSU, it's just that whole identity thing, And I think that one thing we can kind of push, because that's something that we're trying to push in BSA, is having that relationship between graduate students, between black faculty and staff. Because I know me, I am an outlier. I have had so many black professors, I think it's amazing. Almost every semester I get a black professor just because a lot of us don't have black professors when we come to MSU. You don't even know, like I said, they exist. So I think that would be one way of bridging that gap and actually helping us become more retentive. I think that's just an answer. I'm really more into solutions because we have these conversations a lot. And I feel like we all know what's kind of going on. And not to even say that some of because I've had great white professors as well as other, racial ethnicities. And I just think that sometimes we don't have a conversation with people that actually need them. So what are some solutions for that? And actually engaging the people that we're losing, because 9 times out of 10, the people you're losing aren't in that room that you're talking to.
Well, it's interesting about the research indicates that even for high-achieving African-American males from from whatever SES, if they choose not to apply to the larger universities and they go to the smaller four-year colleges or the community colleges. So they do that. So they do that, and so it's interesting that you mentioned that. But research also indicates that for one of the really good success, one of the most encouraging factors for success for students, African American students on the campus, PWI or BW or
HBCU.
HBCU, or I was going to spell it out for those because primarily white institution or historically black college university, in case anyone doesn't know. So one of the key things for graduation in both institutions is having a really good relationship with the faculty member. But unfortunately, at HBCUs, you get that more than you do at PWI. So I think that having a good relationship between faculty and students is really important. And I think Dr. Odoji, she said, I know she's working on some mentoring things for African American instructors and students in African American studies. I know she has that idea, and I've seen a couple of models for it. As a matter of fact, I have a model, a checklist that you use to make sure you're doing it. So I think that is the key. So other than that, I really don't have any other ideas. I will say though that my dissertation chair was a white lady, and she was from Canada, and she was part of my friends. She was badass. Part of my friends, but Canadians come from a completely different racial, perspective. So I tell the story. I was on my. I'm considering Chris is an honorary brother, and Dr. Schweitzer, they're honorary brothers right now. So I was on my way to class, and I was teaching a class that I teach, part of my doc. And in her class, the door was open. I said, hey, Dr. Harper, how you doing? I'm on my way to class. I see you, tomorrow. Get in here. And I was like, where is she? Sit down. And she was angry at me because my voice wasn't strong enough in this paper that I wrote and handed in. And she was like, you're a black man and you need to make it, and it's not about you, and you can make a difference, and if you think you're going to get in trouble, say what you need to say, and if you get in trouble, tell them to come get me, and I kick that. And I'm like, she's yelling at me like she thinks she's my mama. And then she kept going. I was like, oh my gosh, she really does think that she's my mom. She really treated me like I was her son. And so if it wasn't for me having that type of relationship with her, right, and she ran some interference for here's this guy, he wants to do a black masculinity class in the department. She ran a lot of interference for me. So I've had a lot of really good relationships with white faculty. I've had white professors come and grab me and say, look, Ted, sit down. Look, you need to make sure, you need to work on your references. And all right, so I put my references on it. So I've had white professors, so I'm with you. But I think what the problem is, it's really hard with, I've seen white professors and white teachers, you really can't tell if they're hip or not. And you just can't tell. Because it's like Jonathan that was here, he doesn't look like it. Jonathan is really hip, but he doesn't look like it, right? So it's really hard to tell, and I think that's part of the disconnect that we have between black students and white faculty is we really can't tell. Now Dr. Schweitzer here, right? Now he doesn't really look hip, right? But I know he's one of the guys that. But he's done a lot of things in civil rights, activists, and doing a lot of things here for African Americans here on campus for the last 30 years, and you can't tell by looking. And so that's one of those things that I think is part of the disconnect, is that we need to open up and maybe look for, in case we can't, and more opportunities for engagement between students and faculty, which is why I wanted to make sure this was open in case we had students like yourself who wanted to attend. Yes, young lady.
Yes.
I remember you.
Yes. I just wanted to say that when you were just talking about the problem, when I heard a gentleman talking earlier about how it was growing up in Detroit, me coming from Detroit, also in Detroit Public School, one thing transitioning up here that I feel like the problem is, as far as the relationship and just looking and understanding is social mobility. That's one thing that I had to understand. I was coming from a social area where how we responded to things was a lot different than how we respond at a college level. And usually if I come back, if I come back to Detroit around this social network and act the same way as a professor or somewhat, my character is kind of like, who are you now? Because I also think that also should be taken into consideration. When you transition, you are in the period of finding out who you are. And so that whole social mobility path, it's just kind of understanding that, yes,
I want more out of life, understanding what the social classes are, what's expected, and knowing that, yeah, I'm gonna have to change faces depending on who I'm around, what my social environment is. And when you don't understand that, you think that you can still be that same person and say what you want anywhere or any class of people that you're around. And that kind of can come off as being uncomfortable when you're in a room full of maybe, like I said, white teachers, and you hear them talking a certain way and you don't really know how to talk that certain way. So I just feel like just understanding that.
You know, I think you're right. We talked about that. I know you were here for the beginning, but we talked about there being a quiet space or a silent space where people may not feel comfortable talking, and we talked about identity. And one of the things that I put is I have Dr. Cross's African American identity model. And it talks about the processes and stages that you get. Now, you are aware of this, but one of the reasons why I included that is for that same exact reason that you talked about, that there's a process of going on and what you're figuring out. But then I also have the white identity model up there as well. So there's two different types of processes for that. I'm here for a little. If any I'm not trying to push anybody. Any other things we want to discuss? I know we've taken up a little bit of time. I'm here for the long. I appreciate everyone staying so long. You've been here.
Thank you.
No, thank you for coming. Anyone have anything else they want to say? I want to make sure everyone gets a chance to. Oh, and I need people to fill out the form there. Yeah.